Hello, and welcome to episode 165 of Dark and Stormy Book Club. Today we visit with the author Jonelle Patrick. Enjoy.
I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Before we go any further with this episode, we need to express our sincere apologies to the author Dolores Redondo, who we included in our Hispanic episode of last week. She is from Spain. She is a Spanish author. It was my error, and I included her in our Hispanic episode. I sincerely apologize to her publicist. We don't like to make mistakes, but they do happen, but we like to take ownership when we do. And we hope she forgives us. It was certainly unintentional. We did not mean any disrespect. Thank you. And now on with episode 165. The Last Tea Bowl Thief is a book written by Jonelle Patrick, and it was released by 7th Street Books. For 300 years, a stolen relic passes from one fortune seeker to the next, indelibly altering the lives of those who possess it. In modern-day Tokyo, Robin Swann's life has sputtered to a stop. She's stuck in a dead-end job testing antiques for an auction house, but her true love is poetry, not pottery. Her stalled dissertation sits on her laptop, unopened in months, and she has no one to confide in but her goldfish. On the other side of town, Nori Okuda sells rice bowls and teacups to Tokyo restaurants, as her family has done for generations. But with her grandmother in the hospital, the family business is foundering. Nori knows if her luck doesn't change soon, she'll lose what little she has left. With nothing in common, Nori and Robin suddenly find their futures linked to an ancient, elusive tea bowl. Glimpses of the past set the stage as they hunt for the lost masterpiece, uncovering long-buried secrets in their wake. As they get closer to the truth and the tea bowl, the women must choose between seizing their dreams or righting the terrible wrong that has poisoned its legacy for centuries. Jonelle Patrick is the author of 5 novels set in Japan and has been writing about Japanese culture and travel since she first moved to Tokyo in 2003. In addition to the Only in Tokyo Mysteries series, she produces the monthly newsletter Japanogram and blogs at Only in Japan and on her travel site, The Tokyo Guide, I Wish I'd Had. She also teaches at writing workshops, appears as a panelist at Thriller Fest, and was the keynote speaker at the Arrow Rock Writing Workshop. A graduate of Stanford University and the Sendagaya Japanese Language Institute, she's also a member of the Mystery Writers of America, International Thriller Writers, and Sisters in Crime. She divides her time between Tokyo and San Francisco.
We would like to welcome Jonelle Patrick to the program. She has a great book out called The Last Tea Bowl Thief. Welcome, Jonelle.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just thrilled to be here on this podcast.
Well, this was an excellent book, and you did an expert job of weaving the story between 3 different time frames. Did you write 3 different stories and then weave them together, or piece it together as you wrote?
Okay, well, that would have been the smart way to do it. Because this book took me 3 years, as it didn't start out to be a 3-timeline story. As I wrote it, the things that I was just going to deal with as flashbacks, as, modern day with modern day protagonists, the characters started becoming more interesting than that. And it felt like they should tell their stories in their own words. And that's how it ended up having more than one timeline, which is a lot harder to write. When you change something in one of the timelines, it ripples through the entire thing and you have to do a rewrite on the whole thing. The answer is no, I didn't write it as 3 different stories, but the next one I'm working on, that is how I'm doing it. It's just much easier.
Was the history of the Takamatsu family dynasty of ceramic makers based on an actual family, or is it complete fiction?
It totally was based on not an actual family so much, but of the Japanese practice of handing down an artist name. This happens not only in the world of visual arts, but also in the kabuki theater. There are actors who are Kiko-Saemon, the 26th. But there is a family in Kyoto called the Raku family. You've probably heard of Raku pottery. It's probably one of the best known in the West. Their current guy is Raku, 15th of his name now. When I went to the Raku Museum, I discovered something very surprising about these artist families. When you go to the Raku Museum, you look at the exhibits. There are 15 of them. Every generation's artist's life work is represented by 2 tea bowls. For their whole life's work, 2 tea bowls. And you go and you read the tags and it says, well, this guy, he made the lip a little thinner. The next one, it's, well, his were a little more rounded. But if you weren't reading the tags, you'd walk through that exhibit and you'd think it was a one-man exhibit. They all look like they were made by the same guy. In fact, they were, because your obligation when you take on the artist's name is to make tea bowls that are like the tea bowls he made. They aren't copies, but they're made with the same techniques and with the same artistic sensibility. You're not supposed to innovate very much, only in a very narrow way. So this ends up being less about art and more about immortality. Japanese idea of immortality is so different from ours in the West. And that happens in all kinds of stuff in Japan. When I write about Japan, I sort of hope to weave some of these things in where it makes us think there are different ways to think about immortality. And these families kind of embody that. I actually collected something from the town of Karatsu, which is also a big tea ceremony pottery town. I discovered an artist there whose work I really liked, and come to find out, he comes from one of those families, but he's the second son. So his elder brother is the named artist, and his elder brother's work looks like perfect, beautiful e-karatsu. It's, sort of beige, and it's got beautiful little ink paintings on it in brown. His brother uses the same quality of clay and the same glazes and the same beautiful technique. His work is much more modern looking and much more interesting. And so I started thinking about how to marry the idea of this beautiful age-old technique with modern sensibility. How can ancient art meet modern art? And that's sort of where the hook of coming from one of these families came from.
Was there ever a blind craftsman?
Not that I know of, but that grew out of trying to play with the idea of our idea of art and the Japanese idea of art, which is that we tend to think of art as something that one of the things it does is it makes you see the world in a little bit different way, just for a moment. I started thinking about what kind of Japanese artist could achieve that Western ideal of art. And it would have to be somebody who had the command of the technology to make something, but the freedom to pursue their own vision, so to speak. I started imagining what if he was blind, because tea bowls, their value isn't just in how they look. A lot of their value is in how do they feel in your hands? How does it feel when you use them in a tea ceremony? And that has nothing to do with the way they look. When I started writing the book, I was thinking, okay, artist be a blind man. And by the time I finished it, I was thinking, how could a blind man not be an artist? Because if you're blind, you're automatically seeing, the world in a different way. So it's almost like you've got an advantage over other people. Your perceptions are already quite different from others. Will help people see even familiar in a sort of different way.
Very true. How hard was it to research the Japan ceramic business of 300 years ago?
I'm quite embarrassed to say that that was the easiest thing in the whole book. And the reason is that it hasn't changed since 300 years ago. I actually could get on a train, 4 trains actually, and go to the little town of Shigaraki, where there is a kiln, a wood-fired kiln that has been making Shigaraki tea bowls and tea ceremony ware since the time of the Edo era, since the time that Yoshi and Saburo were alive. All I had to do was go to the town, visit that kiln and talk to the people there and see how they made things. And it's all exactly the same as it used to be back then. You find a lot of Japanese art does still use these really ancient techniques. One of the things that they do there that I've always admired, in the West, we tend to be very snippy about what we will call high art. But in Japan, you can be an artist who needs to really command a technological aspect like glass or ceramics or basket weaving. And you're considered just as much of an artist as people who paint pictures or take out photographs. There's no dividing line between craft and art there. A lot of them make these astoundingly beautiful things that require a lot of know-how and mastery to even be able to use the medium. They go beyond that and achieve things that do also make you look at the world differently because they're so beautiful. So they still use these age-old techniques that have been perfected, and a lot of them are doing very new things with it, which is kind of exciting.
I liked your character development in this book. You had Robin, who's an American, and then you had Nori, who's trying her best to live up to her grandmother's expectations. And then you have Kiri, and Kiri was disfigured in a fire, I guess, as a child. Was it a common thing in the society of that time to have a child with an impediment become a nun?
You know, it had very little to do with her impediment. The women who became nuns were women who were inconvenient to their families. And the greatest form of inconvenience was to be unmarriageable. If you're an unmarriageable woman, you live with your family and they've got to feed you and clothe you and make a place for you in the family, but you don't really contribute anything. So women who were unmarriageable either entered convents on their own or they were sent to convents by the head of the family. And what made Kiri unmarriageable wasn't that she was ugly. We would think, oh, well, you know, she had burns on her face. No man would want to marry her. They would see it very differently. The way they saw it is that someone who had been burned badly enough that their face was disfigured was the victim of very, very bad luck. Since luck is not anything you can control, people avoided bad luck by not associating themselves with it. So a man wouldn't want to marry a woman who so very obviously had attracted that level of bad luck. He wouldn't want his family to be associated. He wouldn't want his kids to be associated with it. And so women like that couldn't find husbands, not because of the way they looked, but because of what had happened to them. A lot of women like that did end up being sent to convents or going to convents. Another way a woman could become inconvenient, weirdly enough, is by being too exalted. So there were some imperial convents where women who were associated with the emperor's family, a lot of them, they had to go there. And the reason was that the only person who ranked highly enough to be a match with was the emperor. And if the emperor couldn't marry them because they were too closely related or didn't want to marry them for some reason, their only choice really was to go to a convent because there was nobody else who was worthy of marrying them. Women who were widowed, you know, a lot of emperors' widows ended up going to convents. Women who didn't have a convenient place in society, a lot of them ended up at convents. And these convents turned out to be these enormous treasure troves of art and learning because of that, because these women were highly educated. They were highly trained in all kinds of arts, and they didn't have to go to convents and give everything up. You know, going to a convent wasn't necessarily an austere experience. A lot of them took their servants with them. They brought their clothes. And the reason I know this is that my father-in-law's wife is a very well-known scholar at Columbia University, and her specialty is medieval Japanese literature. And when she was researching an abbess of one of these convents and got to know the nuns at this convent very well, and she'd been coming and interviewing them for several years before they said to her one day over tea, you know, we have this treasure house and, you know, scholars are always knocking on our door wanting to see what's in it. But, you know, we're a convent and they're always men. And so we don't really want to let them see our treasure house. But would you like to take a look inside of it? And this was like King Tut's great-great-great-great-granddaughter saying, would you like to take a look in his tomb? The stuff in that treasure house, they are still minting PhDs out of it. She ended up doing a joint venture